Good evening and welcome everyone to Fungi Map members, visitors across Australia and overseas. We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians throughout this land and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We also recognise the deep cultural and scientific knowledge of Australian fungi held for millennia by Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and we welcome you here today. My name is Susie Webster, and I thank you all for joining Fungi Map's Funginar lecture series, except tonight we have something a little special. We have our first Mixinar, maybe Slimarium, but we've gone with Mixinar. At any time this evening, if you'd like to submit questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your window. And tonight, Ros Hart, our Fungi Map president, will raise these questions during a brief interval in the middle and then again at the end with Steve. That brings us to our topic for this evening, slime moulds, revealing their magic through the lens. The world of slime moulds is a lesser known one. Due to their incredibly small size, they're generally overlooked and rarely observed by passers-by. Whilst their habitat is most often associated with forest environments, they commonly occur in residential settings, but still they remain little observed in this field of study. More recently, people are starting to pay attention to these minute worlds and are recording and photographing myxomycetes. As such, there is a growing interest in employing sophisticated techniques to do this, and the specialists are achieving amazing results. This is a potted chronology of Steve's journey of trial and error, problem solving that has ultimately yielded visually pleasing results, as well as excellent photographic renditions of good scientific value. There are many publications Steve's in, and I know it's tricky to see with the background, but National Geographic for March, he's got wonderful photo story in there. And this is number 2, but Slime Moulds by Sarah Lloyd, edition number 3, and various other places as well. Worth hunting them down. So on that note, I'd like to introduce today's Mixinar speaker, Steve Young, photographer extraordinaire of all things super tiny, namely slime moulds. Take it away, Steve.
Well, hi there, guys. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about my little world and all things slime mould. And by the way, those guys that are joining us tonight to have a look, I really hope that I can actually rub off some of my enthusiasm for this wonderful subject. And without any further ado, I'm going to just get a little screen sharing going and pop into our first half of the presentation. And what I'm going to do is put those up there. And okay, so yes, the title is Slime Moulds, Revealing Their Magic Through the Lens. And we've got 2 halves of this particular presentation. In the first half, I want to talk about basically very quickly about how I started in this process, and that's all about starting with fungi. You'll be pleased to know, starting with fungi, and how I really stumbled across slime moulds by accident. I had no understanding of their existence prior to that. I realised very quickly that my ability to actually shoot them was quite inadequate in the first instance. So this is a bit of a journey about that process, and we'll go through some early success stories on that. Have a break. Ros will take over the question section of that, and then after that we'll continue on, get more serious about the process, upskill me entirely, spend some more money on equipment. Slowly learn about the nature of them, and these are little very precious little things in the forest. They're extremely delicate, and I had to learn how to deal with them and actually work with them. I want to introduce you to my Slimarium, which has not only been a bit of fun in the slime mould world, but certainly has actually added to the value of some of the beauty that we get from these little fellows. And then at the very end, before we break for another segment of questions, I'll talk about maybe where I'm going with my photography as a result of where I'm at the moment. So let's get going. So there is a bit of a disclaimer before we start. I just need you to understand, if you had scientists at one end of the spectrum and science experts and citizen scientists down there on the right-hand side, I need to let you know that categorically, unequivocally, I'm at the very other end of the scale. I'm a photographer. That's where I've come from. And so I guess my journey in this particular segment of my life is all about learning about mixos as a byproduct of starting that image making process. So technical questions about slime molds, we'll hand that over to people that know more about it, and way more than I know about it. Okay, I had very quickly, a long corporate career, 3 decades in the paint industry. That led me to transition to commercial photography, and I moved up to Coffs Harbour, which I think is an absolute paradise up here. I've got rainforest just behind me, like literally minutes away, and stunning water to fish in, out the front door, which is terrific. So that actually led me for another 10 years or so until I started retiring, but I wanted to keep my hand in at photography, and I thought, well, I know about fungi, I love the forests, I love my walking and all the rest, let's get started. So I need to just sort of set the scene for this. So if I was doing an environmental portraiture in my commercial photography days, then I would be doing something like the 3 examples I've put up here. Now, the idea of a portraiture is to have your subject matter front and center. And in that regard, if I've got a background that is just telling a bit more of the story through the image itself, it just adds value to the subject matter. So my aim in heading out into the forest to photograph fungi was to do environmental portraiture of fungi. And that's sort of like my aim in this whole process. So we get into the forest, we start shooting, and I'm learning on the run. I'm out there just looking, and I'm finding, and I'm loving what I'm finding. The fact that they don't move is really excellent for me to get started with my process of shooting. And I'm loving the textures. I'm loving the variation and the colors. And like this particular little one here, I had to shoot the base of this. I mean, that stunning, gnarled base and those mycelium that are coming out of that section of log, to me, was telling a bit of a story about that particular fungi. I go into the forest, it's been raining for days, I'll just wander in there and see what I can find. And I come across this sort of thing where I've got, life bursting out of this particular beautiful little being. And, it's just a pleasure to shoot. So, really enjoying the process. I knew about boletes when I was a kid, because we always had edible boletus around the old, properties and the like. But I didn't know that anything other than gills existed. And so, the likes of these fungi were quite exceptional to find. And, walking through a forest line where you're seeing tiny little red, protrusions out of this very, ordinary leaf fodder. Beautiful, stunning little mushrooms to shoot. So very, very enjoyable process there. And of course, the obligatory night shot. I found this one down in one of my rainforests, about 1.25 kilometres down during the day. And I've gone, well, I've got to go back and shoot them. And I knew where all the trapdoor spider holes were, and I'm, darn sure that the reptiles are going to be out feeding and all the rest. But I ripped down through the forest, did my shot, and then came out, and I was very pleased to get that as well. So one to tick off the bucket list, so to speak. And of course, the old schizophyllum. I found a lovely patch of these, really healthy, vibrant new growth, and I had to shoot the underside to show that split gill of these, and we move on and do some more. And the jellies and the corals, and the ones that on this lovely earthy timber substrate with the vibrant yellows and reds and oranges, they also were quite photogenic to actually shoot. Quite lovely. And you find a blue, you find a lovely subtle blue, and I've not found too many of these, and I really enjoyed shooting this one for the very pleasure of having the ability to shoot a blue mushroom in the forest, which I thought was pretty cool. So having fun with this, really enjoying the process. And then I stumbled across mixos. And in fact, these weren't the ones that I stumbled across. My first mixos that I found were the little Assyrias. And I found oranges and pinks on a log, and I photographed them. Now, what I'm showing you here is that I've lost the ability to shoot my environmental portrait. What I've got is like Parramatta Road, or I've got Flinders Street Station, or I'm back in the crowd. And I'm not happy with that because I want to shoot environmental portraitures. So I have to start thinking about the process of how I'm going to deal with that. So now I'm going to offer up an apology at this point in time. I'm going to have to take you through a little bit of theory, and that theory is going to help you understand where I'm going with my shooting. So for those who are old enough to remember, you know, we all started off with 35mm negs, and what I want to say, well, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that if you hear the terminology full frame digital sensor, what that means is the sensor in that digital camera is exactly the same size as the old 35mm neg. So in actual fact, it's actually 36mm, but you know, courses for courses. So when you have a full frame digital camera, that's what you're getting. You're getting a sensor that has the ability to shoot the same as the old 35 negs. But my poor little tiny subjects are appearing again, you know, like a whole street full of people on that, and I've got to do something to actually get me closer to it. So we all probably know about macro lenses, and maybe not everyone, but certainly extension tubes or extension rings are the next stage in getting closer to them. So how these work is this. So if, for example, we've got a macro lens and it has what they call a 1-to-1 ratio. We're talking about size ratios here. This is the theory part that will help you understand where I'm going with this later on. So a 1-to-1 ratio means that if you've got an object that's 1 centimetre tall, and you shoot it with a macro lens, then it will end up 1 centimetre high on your sensor. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio in size. So for example, when you're working with extension tubes, you can actually build them up to, for example, up to and beyond 1-to-1 ratio, so that you're shooting like for like. If your object's 1 centimetre tall, then it appears 1 centimetre tall on your sensor. Now, I'd like every one of us here to measure out 1 centimetre with your fingers for me right now, okay? I want you to look at that, and now I want you to halve it. So now you're looking at 5mm, right? I want you to halve it again, and now we're looking at 2.5mm. Now you have the average size of a mixo. So you've got some that are way larger and you've got some that are way smaller, but 2.5mm is about our standard size for our shooting range. So you'll just need to hold that thought when we move into this process from here. So I'm going to employ my extension tubes. I'm going to move into this world, and I start shooting. And this is my very first shot with the extension tubes on the lens, and I'm delighted with the results. I've got a very, very small fungi. It's growing on a leaf, and it's a beautiful subject, and I'm delighted with the outcome of that. And I've gone, okay, well, let's get stuck into it. Where's my mixos? And we start shooting with our extension rings, and I'm getting good results. Now these Stemonitis are quite a bunch of, and they're also quite large. These fellows are probably in 1.5 centimetre probably in size, so quite large in the scheme of things. But still, I'm happy with that particular result. I'm getting closer to these Assyria now, and I've got a bit more detail showing in the stems and a bit of translucency coming through. Now, with this system, I'm beginning to say, what do I like about this and what don't I like about this? A little bit of softness around the edges when I shoot with these extension rings, negative for me. Okay, we move forward. Hemitrichia colliculata, yep, happy with that. Early stage of this one, lovely and orange. It's quite a lovely result. Okay, Ceratio mixofruticulosa, an early one that we see after rain. I've got pretty close to that. I'm happy. Let me move on. The Assyria denudata, I call this the forest feather dusters. They're a lovely little, quite a large mixo. And if you look down here, you'll see a very, very small group of Cribraria, and there in itself shows a huge variation in size in the mixo world. So we'll deal with that later on, but we move on. And now, okay, I've gone in as tight as I can with this system. I don't like it. It's very soft around the edges, it's quite blurry, and I've gone, where do I go from here? All right. So we start, we raid the bank, we buy a beautiful Japanese lens. It's a 5-to-1 ratio. And what that means is my 1 centimetre object, let's go down, let's say our 3 millimetre object is going to be 5 times larger on the sensor. So now I'm getting a 15 millimetre high result on my 24 millimetre high sensor. This system requires that we now take many, many shots because our depth of field, the amount of material that's in focus is very, very small, so only a thin wafer. And we have to take a series of shots and then marry them together in software. So now we have our lens on a camera, on a rail system, driven by a little computer, and we take a series of shots and we walk our way through that focus plane until we've got everything through focused. And then we look at our software, and the two standards are either Zarine or Helicon, and we use that software to marry them together. Okay, that's the process. Now here's our little Focera and Viridae that we took previously, and now this is the results with our 5-to-1 ratio lens. I'm now getting very close to having my environmental portraiture back. Now I've taken 30 to 50 images. I've got about 3 gigabytes of data that I'm processing to get one image, and the process takes about an hour to get one image out the other end. But at least we're getting there, and the process unfolds as a result of that. So I'll walk you through some of my early results. Now this little fellow, Laomyxa cerifera, certainly found in Tasmania. I know that there's a number of 2 or 3 people that have found it in Victoria. And I think there's 2 or 3 sightings here up in New South Wales, one of which is in my forest. Delighted with this. I mean, I love the waxy collar that this particular little beast has. It's a very, very showy myxo. Also quite a large one. This is probably about 3 to 4 to 5 millimeters tall, but a lovely showy metallic iridescent capon. Again, 30 to 50 images to get that one image out. Cribarius species. And this was a sample that Teresa Vanderhul gave me, but I had to shoot it, and I love it. Now, if you look behind you, you'll probably see a triptych up there on a curved wall I have. That's that particular image put up on the wall, which I desperately love. I found the same Cribaria cancellata in my forest, a fresher sample, so I took that again. This is a record. I love them. And we move on. I've got more Cribaria here, and I'm not too sure of exactly which species it is, but it's one that I get quite often. It's a lovely, delicate, smaller Cribaria, and again, that lovely bird cage sits around this basket of spores. And I'm going to show you the next image, which I really love. This particular one was in that same mix that I found from Bruxner. And I love it particularly because even though all the fruit have dehissed, the spores are coming out, it has that progression of, I guess, evolution, that once the spores have shed, it leaves the shell on the outer, and then the shell begins to disintegrate over time. So it's a very, very telling storyline, I guess, in the scheme of things. And a beautiful Assyria denudata. Now, this is quite a large one, and it filled the frame. Now, I want you to take note of the background in this. This is part of a function of this particular lens situation that I have. It has these 3 little globes in the front of it, and as a result, you have to actually expose your image for the front of the setting very, very carefully. And with larger subjects like this, the background automatically goes quite black. So I've lost that ability to actually get more of an environmental approach to it. So, again, a negative from my shooting system in this regard. And here's another example of that. and I'll draw your attention. It's actually the same mixo, and I'll draw your attention to the fact that this particular fruiting I brought out of the forest. I brought it home as best I could and in the best condition I could, but it stalled along the way. And I suspect that also what has happened when I put it close to the lens to actually to shoot this particular one, it's seen the lights and it's actually really started to retract and it's actually stalled. Nonetheless, it's quite a nice shot. I've got the background issue. I've also got those beautiful 3 legs there of some insect that's hiding around behind the light. I'm not too sure whether you can see or not. It's there. So again, I'm having great success with this, but along the way, you know, there are those problems emerging in my mind that I have to solve. We'll go a little further up the track from where I am. It's 20k up the road. There's a beautiful waterfall walk. I was down there with a friend one day, and we were wandering through, and I sensed what was happening on the forest floor. And I rarely find mixos at this early stage on anything other than timber. I just have not had the ability in my mind to actually grasp finding these in the leaf litter. But this was very evident because of the white legs on these. And so this Diarchaea leucopodia, beautiful little metallic again, was in swathes. It was a massive swarm. And then as we walked down a little creek line, and we found a second swathe of it, which was quite lovely to find. So, having the ability to bring it home and shoot it was quite lovely. I've still got some samples of this, well in excess of 12 months ago. I think I shot this maybe nearly 2 years now, and the samples are still pretty much intact. And I think perhaps this metallic shield, if intact and it's dried down at that level, seems to have a more rigid surface on the outer of these to help them be preserved. Okay, so we've got a couple more, Hemitrichia colliculata. I love this image because it's got the emerging fruit in the base here, as well as having one that's hissed quite strongly. Now, again, dark background, not happy, and a lot of specular highlights in the foreground. And that's a symptom of having if you've got a wet substrate or even a shiny surface to deal with, it's very, very hard with these lights so close to the object to actually, get sense out of an image. So, again, a bit of a negative as part of this. And yes, Phycerella oblonga. I found this in Plasmodium form first up. All curly, beautiful Plasmodium that clumped into curls. And then I was able to track its growth. Harvested some material, brought it back and photographed it. Quite a large fruit. And also a relatively rare one in Australia, I have to say. Blow me down. Sometime later, I found one growing in my own garden. So, isn't that interesting? Now, the one that, this is another view of this first one that I'm showing you now. And that's fully dehissed. Quite a beautiful set of capillidium in there, and there's grey spores still kicking around on the surface there. Lovely image. The next one is from the second sporing. The second fruiting that I found here. And it's a very, very flat fruit. Like it literally just grew along the surface. And I put this image up, and there's a lot of discussion around the world about this not being a Phycerella oblonga. But one of our specialists in the US said, yes, categorically it can grow like this. So it's been ratified as a second observation from underneath my bungalow palms here in my little garden. So there you go. Okay. A Ceratomyxa species, consternation whether it's fruticulosa or Spirosperma. It looked different in the field, so I very quickly photographed it out in the field, harvested some samples, brought it back, isolated those little branches, and took up a close-up. Now, this poor fruit that loves the wet, I stuck it in under the lights in my little stage area. It starts literally flailing around like this. It just literally hated the light. It was literally trying to retract, and I'm trying to take 30 to 50 images of a stable subject matter, and it was all over the place. So I had a really terrible time in getting 2 or 3 decent shots out of this, and that's about the best I could actually muster, to be honest. In this regard, this is the last slide before we turn over to Ros to take up some questions for us. Pros with this lens, brilliant clarity. The glass is extraordinary from this Japanese manufacturer. I love the 5:1 shooting ratio, way better than our 1:1, and generally awesome results on my journey. On the other side of the coin though, working distance, having to put the object inside this little gateway here and subject them to the lights was terrible. You could only fit very small samples in. So if I had a log with it on, I couldn't actually shoot it. I had to break off pieces, and the handling process became quite hard. So again, a lot of failures in this particular segment of my activity. So we'll leave it there. I'll just stop the screen for the moment and hand over to Ros for some questions, and then we'll pick up the second half when we're ready. Over to you, Ros.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. There's some magnificent photos. They're really interesting. So one of the questions, which I think you virtually answered in that other one there, was just how close are you to those Mixos when you're taking their picture? And you've obviously got them in that little round section there.
Absolutely
so they're
correct.
Very, very close.
The working distance was about 1.5 centimetres, so extremely close to actually shoot them. Quite a trauma for the fruits, and a trauma for me to set them up in the first place.
Yes. Did you get a few splattered on your lenses a few times?
No, we were very careful about that.
You're very careful about that, right? That's good to hear. So do I have any more questions? At the moment, I don't. So what I'm going to ask you, Steve, amongst all these Mixos that you've found, do you have a particular favourite, or do you just like them all?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's funny, I have a favourite, like Elea Mixer was definitely my favourite for ages.
Yes.
But the more I find that are less common, and I've got a couple at the moment that are unidentified that we've got, the people around the world scratching their heads about. I've got to send samples over next week. There's some going to Russia and some going to America because potentially they're just saying we have no idea. So I guess they become my favourites for now, and the world moves on, I guess. Yes.
That's right. And how lovely to be able to communicate with people from all over the world who are actually really interested.
Social media is the best. It absolutely is the best.
It's really good. So I don't know, just check here. Have you ever tried using a microscope and photographing with a microscope, is a question on here.
Personally, no, and I categorically say, come back to that continuum. I'm down this photographic end, and the scientists, the microscopy work, I leave to them. In my other world, my microfossil work, I use microscopes all the time. But from a point of view of doing that with microscopes, no, I haven't. I guess I'm barreling down the technology that I know to bring that to my satisfactory levels, I guess.
And you're doing some amazing things, so I think that's a really good road to keep on at the moment. Because
we'll keep going. Yes.
Yes, exactly. So there's no more questions at the moment. So if you would like to continue, that would be good.
All right. Well, look, let me just pop out to one of these other presentations for the minute, and I will go to this one, and I will get it happening. I will then come back to there. Wait a second. And now we'll share the screen with this one, and we will continue. All right, back in action. Okay, so we left off, and this is where we left off, and I'm going to solve all those negatives with the next part of the process. So the best option is to spend more money, and now I'm still using the 5:1 on a lot of work, less so on Mixos these days. But all these negatives, the very, really fine working distance, the fact that I can only use small samples, and the fact that Mixos hate that lighting setup is solved by what you see behind over my shoulder. And we enter now with a microscope objective, and if you can read what it says on there, it's a 10 times. And what that means is now I'm going from a 5:1 ratio to a 10:1 ratio. So I'm doubling the size of my objects when I park them on the camera sensor. So our 2mm Mixo becomes 20 millimeters on a 24 millimeter high sensor. So we're getting down to the real end of the business in this regard. And I'll show you the setup now. So here's our camera on the left-hand side of the screen. Just a standard Canon camera on our stack shot platform. Now that particular, as you know, most of you will know from your microscopy work, if you've got a microscope objective, it needs a tube lens above it to resolve your image up to your eye. And that particular microscope objective needs a 200 millimeter tube lens, so to speak. So what you're seeing on my camera there is a 200 millimeter lens attaching the microscope objective to the end of that. Now I've got a working distance of about 10 centimeters past the end of that objective, which is fantastic. And it allows me to open up the scope to, using my studio lighting that I've got in the background there and also in the central area there. Now I can do this in the dark because I'm using studio flash, and I've got my flash set at 125th of a second. So it goes bang, and that's it. That's the only light the Mixo sees. It's not even sure it's seen it. So it's not worried. So way less failures in this regard. Now, the other piece of equipment I want to show you there is this little stage area, and I've got that pictured on the right-hand side. This is an ingenious setup. With these small objects, you've got to be able to finitely move them so you get them in your viewfinder so you can shoot them. That stage has little screw knobs. You might be able to see those on it, and it allows you to actually minutely move the stage in the X and the Y axis. So I can move the bottom screw and I can move the platform this way. And if I move the one at the back, I can move the platform up and down. So I have the ability to actually really finely place my Mixos in exactly the same spot where I want. A really nice setup. Now, the downside of, well, one of the opportunities with using these microscope objectives is that our depth of field is way much shorter, and it means I've got to take many more images. So I'll show you the first one in the series. So this is a beautiful Slimarium species. I've got to take about 150 images to get just that little object in focus. Now, I want to come back to your little your centimetre scale. We're going to halve it. We're going to go down to 2.5 mils. And then we're going to go to 1 mil between your fingers, right? I want you to do that so you see a millimetre. Now there's 1,000 microns in a millimetre, and my depth of field is 7 microns. So I'm only getting a very, very thin slice in focus at one time. So I'm going to have my object in my frame sitting upright so that I can actually just move my camera that much distance. If I've got him bent like this, I've got to move all that distance, and it would take me hundreds and hundreds of images. So I'm going to always try and get an image that's upright, start here and go to there, and I'm still taking about 150 images to get that one image out. I've got about 8 or 9 gigabytes of data now, about an hour and a half type of work to process it all, but we're getting the results. So we'll work through this, and I'll show you some of the activity that we're getting out now. So at our foray with friends up in Dorrigo, not this year, just gone with the previous year, we found these beautiful Cribraria cancellata. This is the heads of them. And, like these heads are way less than a millimetre across. And I guess I wanted to see how close I could get to these with a fairly clean image, and that's about the results. Quite a lovely little result there. We're now seeing spores. We're seeing individual spores quite readily with this. So we go to Fora with friends in Dorrigo this year, just gone, the end of February. I go to the same area, I find more Cribraria up there, take them home, and we shoot them again. And I reckon the cages, the bird cage around these ones, looks a bit more rigid this year. So I guess I'm seeing an observation about the year, the seasonal growth of these being a little bit different, maybe. Maybe I'm just imagining it, but I think they look a bit more structured, a bit stronger in their growth. Trichia verrucosa. Yeah, an interesting subject. It's quite a large fruit. I've got a little patch up in my forest here that performs after a rain. It's inside a log. I always have a bit of a look, and occasionally I'll find some. I brought them home and photographed them. Very happy with the results. I was able to watch the process as it unfolded and it evolved. Now, I need to introduce you to my Slimarium. So enter COVID at the beginning of last year. Three things happened. Mixo season's on, like the fungi season was. This is early, around the January period. Just after our foray, I had to go and get some foot surgery, so I'm out of action. I'm running around on crutches for a while. COVID hits and we're all isolated. Fortunately, I have bought a whole raft of secondhand aquarium tanks, fish tanks. And the objective in my mind is simple. I wanted to have an environment that I was going to assimilate rainforest conditions in. I was sick of getting mould in petri dishes. I was sick of getting mould in takeaway containers. So I thought, I think the volume of air above my surface is going to be part of the key to this. I needed a bigger chamber. So the idea of this is to actually have that larger volume of air. The idea of this is to have lids on most of these to allow some humidity to build up in the area. The other idea is to have areas cut out of these so that there's airflow circulating in that volume of air. These are situated under a veranda facing south. The veranda is like a canopy in the rainforest. And I guess I'm trying to assimilate all the attributes I'm finding Mixos in. Little direct sun. In fact, I only noticed for about a couple of weeks that very first light in the middle of summer, there was about 10 to 15 minutes worth of light that passed directly over those tanks. Beyond that, it's just ambient light, which is exactly what I was after in having that beautiful, the depths of the rainforest where we find most of the Mixos. I guess the other thing about these is that, we wet them down and we note that Mixos grow. They love the moisture when the plasmodium are crawling around. They come to life, and when they find an area that's slightly dried, then they seem to fruit. So they find a high ground, so to speak. So we know that in these tanks, I've actually allowed their moisture to reduce, and we watch the growth of these, which is terrific. And when I find that they're drying out a bit much, I make it rain. I get the tap, and I got my hose, and I just literally make my rainforest rain again, and the process starts again. As the fodder and everything reduces down to nothing, I throw more in. None of this protect it and start again with a new petri dish. Chuck it in, because that's what happens in the rainforest. And I think so far it seems to be bearing fruit literally. So I love these for the fact that I can actually produce in here, and secondly, it aids my ability to take material out of the forest, put it in here in a chamber that's going to keep it nice while I'm photographing its processes, which is a terrific step forward. Now, very early in the piece, one of the first piece of timber I put in, that shot on the right, you may be able to vaguely see the flow or the flush of yellow right across that timber area. That's a massive swarm of Slimarium viridae. It might have been my first success factor. And you could also notice how empty that tank is by comparison to what they're looking like now. So these are now 15 months old or thereabouts, and I'm just going to keep adding to them. And no doubt, knowing me, I'll probably add more tanks as time goes on. Anyway, we'll keep going. A few more results now with our 10-to-1 ratio shooting, and now we're getting down to the fruit. Now I'm back at my environmental portraiture level, and I'm delighted with the results. So I've got this, an early stage of this particular fruit, and what I'm able to do with this particular fruit was put it back in the Slimarium, bring it out again a little time later, take a shot, and repeat the process over time. So I'm actually being able to create a beautiful series over time, all the while putting it back in the Slimarium to actually allow it to, be a protected and long-living process. Excuse me. We'll move on. Oops. So here's one of my first efforts of getting close to Cerathiomyxa reticulosa. My chambers have dried down, my Slimarium has dried down somewhat, and I've wet it out. And one of the first ones to appear in a rainforest after the rain is always this. So now I see it emerge. So I'm able to take it out of the chamber, start shooting it as it's actually emerging out of the substrate. And this to me was a lovely, lovely little exercise to go through. I love the process. And then I get to a stage where later on, I'm shooting it after it's sporing or at the time it's sporing. Now, what I love about this particular Mixo is it actually grows its spores on the outside of its protrusions. I'm not too sure whether it's the only one in the Mixo world that does that, but certainly the majority that I know of, all have a cap that breaks open in some way. But this one, it does it on the outside. So it's lovely to be able to sort of show that process up close and personal. So I'm in my forest one day, and there's a monstrous big tree that's fallen across a creek, but the main buttress area is slightly raised off the ground, and I was literally under it, and I saw this stunning, with a torch, I saw this stunning, sparkle coming back at me, and it was this. So I photographed it in the forest. I brought it home, and I put it in my Slimarium, and I put it up online overnight. And all the people in the Northern Hemisphere that are awake when we're all asleep said, "Oh yeah, that's Metatrichia vesparium." And it seems to be very common in the Northern Hemisphere, across Europe and North America, etc. Very few sightings in Australia, again. So I've gone back and I've found earlier fruiting of this, and I've harvested a few of those fruits because I wanted to get up close and take some decent shots. So now we're getting in and we're actually showing the stunning nature of this lovely skin that holds the spore mass, and this stunning iridescence that these little fellows have. I must admit, I'm only showing you 3 or 4 of this, but I've got probably a dozen or more separate shots, because I really, really love this iridescence that I find on these. And these skins, I guess, because they're non-porous, I guess, they have an ability to refract the light somehow. So they're very beautiful. Now this bloke, look at this. Now, like, this guy's probably only maybe a week old. It's like the old man of the forest in the Mixo world. Beautiful, gnarled buttress in the base there. The characteristic of this one is that it does actually break around that cap area and pops open, and then the spores come forth from there. Again, getting some of that metallic iridescence showing. And I wanted to actually get in with this one as tight as I possibly could with the 10:1 ratio system. So I've actually taken as close a shot I can of one that's burst open, and I've blown the image up to a reasonably intact image. And look at this. I'm now looking at capillidium inside this. I'm seeing the character of the capillidium, and I'm also seeing those spores a bit like Heinz baked beans. I think they're quite large in the scheme of things, but definitely, I'm just delighted with the size that I'm able to get to with the 10:1, the 10:1 ratio. Anyway, we move on. So back in my Slimarium, I see this tiny little Slimarium, this tiny little slime mold at Plasmodium stage crawling around, and it was green. I put my eyeglass on it, and I watch it for a day or two, and then one morning I get out there and I've got this happening. Quickly, I take this log in, I put it on my little stage over the back there. I shoot this series, I go to pick it up, and it drops. It rolls off the stage, hits the table, bounces off, goes to the floor, and rolls to the back of the wall. And I've gone, well, I'm glad I've got this particular shot, because I've just killed this one big time. Anyway, long story short, I put it back in the Slimarium. I checked it some hours later, and blow me down. I've certainly damaged it. We've got fruits, but they've prevailed through the tragedy of human intervention, and they've actually fruited, which I think is fantastic. there are, I'm of the view that there are Slimarium variety. I've got no idea what they are. I don't think the world's seen them yet. I think you guys are the first ones to see them. I took a couple more shots as it progressed, and as you can see over here on the right-hand side, we've even got one that's stalled and it's got a secondary growth that's come through, and it's actually dehissed and is sporing. So it'll live on for another day. So quite an interesting little fellow. So this is from a substrate that came from Bruxner, and I find this small but beautiful flush of these perfectly round mirror ball Dancing with the Stars mixos, beautiful silver metallic, and the characteristic, and this was again identified by people around the world, which is great. The characteristic of this one is that when it's growing up, it has this lovely globule that grows up on the actual stem of it. And as it actually dries down, that globule stays like a beautiful piece of gold leaf around it. I had a second flush of those recently, actually, and I photographed some more of them. So yes, I've again got the process happening here. It's just beginning to dehiss. And then the one on the right-hand side there, it's fully dehissed. There's no more spores left. The outer skin's gone, and all I'm left with is this beautiful round, section of capillidium underneath. Now, before we move off this particular slide, I want to draw your attention to this area here on the first slide. Now, I've put a little scale bar there. That scale bar is 1/2 of 1 millimetre tall. And beside it here, we have a tiny Cribraria growing up down at the 1/2 millimetre level, full size, 1/2 millimetre. Tiny, 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 tiny. So we're progressing down into the forest, so to speak, deeper into the jungle. They're down there. And now we'd never see these unless, you do the photography, I guess. But I'm just so lucky I was able to see that during the process. Here's a couple of non-identified ones. Again, I feel obligated to shoot them if they're coming up in my Slimarium. So I've taken these shots. Again, I don't think they've been aired up until tonight, actually. And I've got a couple of stages of these. The beautiful translucence I'm getting through the stems of these. I guess the ability to actually place my lighting to take advantage of what I want to shoot in these is very helpful with this greater working distance, and that's a good example, I guess. We're getting a bit of the brain happening here. We're beginning to see the beginnings of the inside of the mixo forming. We've got the capillidium and the spores beginning to form inside the beast, so to speak. There's a different fruit, but in the same series, slightly more advanced stage. And again, I just love the image. It tells me so much about their growth process. So we move on. Now I'm getting close to the last couple of my slides here, and maybe I'll just hover a bit on this particular storyline. So Slimarium roseum. So John and Teresa down in southern New South Wales have this crop up all the time in their little forest. And they have got some absolutely stunning images. And John, with his super macro work like this lately, has just produced an extraordinary series recently, which I love. He rings me because they were up in the foray for a few days prior to it starting. He rings me. He said, "Guess what I found?" And I've gone, "What?" And he told me. He said, "I've got a red plasma." So he found one deeper down into the forest, and we went down and tried to find it, and it had pretty much gone. So on the Sunday, I'm tracking down through one of our areas, and I was talking to Louise Elder at the time, and I've got my torch out, and I'm underneath that big log, and I found this beautiful red plasma that's showing on the right-hand side there. Now, Louise Elder took these shots for me. I'm so glad she did, because it helps complete the storyline of this particular process. So I've gone, okay, this is Sunday morning. I'm not going to be home until Monday afternoon. I'm going to harvest a bit of this particular plasma and take it back, and hopefully I can have it still intact by the time I get back to Coffs Harbour. And we put it in the chamber, and we just see what happens, see whether we can get it going. So I actually recognised that this particular area that it was growing in was very dark. It wasn't as exposed as I'd normally find a mixo. It was quite deep under this particular log, and it was extremely wet. So the plasma was in very, very wet conditions. So I've kept that going. I've got it back, and rather than have one of those lids that has got the air circulating, I've put it in a chamber or a big plastic box with a sealed lid, and it's very wet inside. I've tried to assimilate those conditions in the forest. So, okay, it goes in there Monday afternoon. Tuesday, we get up, and I'd taken a shot on the Sunday afternoon for posterity of the plasma itself. I've gotten rid of all these little bugs that were eating my precious little gem. And Tuesday, I note that it's clumping, and away we go. So we start to take a couple of reasonably, large shots in the scheme of things. And then, in the space of an hour or two, it's beginning to actually fruit up. So I've gone, now's the time to get the 10-to-1 ratio out and do something decent with it. So we start that process. Here's our protrusion. We put it back in the chain, into our Slimarium. In an hour or so's time, I've taken it out again. It's beginning to actually look like a fruit now, which is fantastic, and away we go. I let it go, and I've taken a couple more series. At midnight, I took this particular image on the left. So our fruits are now beautifully formed, and they're on their way. I've gone to bed. I've gotten up early, around 6. I've set everything up, and around 6:30, I'm shooting again. And I've got this lovely, lovely plum thing happening now, which is just fantastic. And so the process went on, and then we've got now mature fruits, and I'm just blown away by this. I really, this was a holy grail moment for me in finding this, and then having the thing fruit back home, which is just fantastic. So I'm loving what I'm getting out of this, and I notice underneath this fruit here that there is this iridescence under these beautiful pink calcium outside. So I find a fruit that I can look at the back of, but sure enough, here's this extremely beautiful iridescence and metallic showing through. So extremely lucky and delighted with the process as unfolded, both finding it in the field, bringing it home, and using the Slimarium to my advantage for this process. My last particular shot for this series with this one, I just found these 3 fruits, very photogenic, a lovely ethereal image, and it's the one where they're just starting to dehisce. I'll leave the Fusarium roseum now, and I'm down to my last series of slides of pictures, and I've got a very, very small, what I think is a Cribraria, but it may be a Clastoderma species. So I've got 2 specimens that I've photographed. One here, which has all its spores still intact, and a beautiful specimen that's got them all missing, and it's just the birdcage left. Now, I put a scale bar on this one. It's about 1.7 millimeters tall, and that head is 0.2 of a millimeter wide. So we're getting clarity of our images with this equipment down to 200 microns or thereabouts. Now, on the question of whether it's a Clastoderma or a Cribraria, there are a couple of people that want samples. I've got to send off. I've got to go back and get some more. And we've had a bit of rain in the last few days, and I'm thinking they're probably going to be up at the moment. So I will try and get some. But if we look at a Clastoderma that's similar, here we have one that's appeared in my tanks here. It's a Clastoderma debarianum. It's about 1 millimeter tall, and it has this very characteristic little protrusion, a globule in the center, but it has a head very similar to what we're shooting. So back to my other one now. It does look similar. So we'll get some samples. We'll send them off. I think they're going to Russia in this instance, to Dimitri, and we'll see what the outcome might be on those. So I guess that takes me through to where to from here. This is my last slide, last couple of slides. And I love this particular one because it sort of sells the picture. I've got an Assyria over here. I've got no idea which version it is. It's about 2 millimeters tall. I've got a beautiful Clastoderma debarianum there. That's about 1 millimeter or a touch less. And now look down here. We have these little fellows down on my substrate floor that are tiny, and I see them all the time, as do others. I've spoken to Alison Pollock in the US about them. I've spoken to Sarah Lloyd about them, and we all see them. Teresa believes she's got an identification for them. But I guess where I'm going with this is deeper into the jungle and somehow to find an ability to get down and shoot those more purposefully. So it's smaller and smaller, and this is my last slide. Next level down, are we going to find new mixos? Are we going to be able to shoot more of the detail, find new organisms that are related to the field? So I guess in an equipment sense, and it sort of hangs off whether we shoot with microscopes or whether we shoot with camera equipment, we're bridging the gap somehow between the two. And maybe there is a hybrid way of shooting high resolution shots with microscope, functionality as well. So maybe there might be a stage where we can get to imaging the spores and the capillidium for ID purposes, barreling down this particular pathway and do the whole process from start to finish. So I guess I'd like to just sign off there and pass back to the crew, and flick back to larger screen and pass back to you guys for any more questions that are there.
Well, thanks, Steve. Quite magnificent. So I went to a lecture probably about 11 years ago by Steve Stevenson, and he was the first time that I'd actually really learned a reasonable amount about slide molds. And I loved his observation at the end, and he said, this is a whole world full of miniature works of art.
Yes, exactly.
They are just so beautiful. And yet, I mean, one of the main things that scientists do is observe. And Steve, you're doing the observation, absolutely. So, what you're doing is fantastic for all of us to try and work out what we've got. But I do have a series of questions that people have asked. And one of them is, when you're actually photographing in the forest, how much of your equipment are you taking out in the forest to do this?
Great question. And the answer is categorically none of this. It's driven off 240 volts. Unless I want to carry a big 240 volt power pack with me, it's not going to happen. And I made that call very early, that I knew that if I wanted to make sense with this particular photography, then I had to find a way of looking after, harvesting and looking after fruit to bring back and do in this environment. So I guess that answers it. The early segments when I was shooting with macro lenses and extension rings, that always travels with me in case I need to take a wider angled shot. But this stuff is more specialized and comes back to the studio.
Thank you. Another question is, are your images JPEGs or RAW?
Great question. I always shoot in RAW. That's just a commercial photographer always shoots in RAW. And as a result, the stacking of software can't handle RAW files. So I've got to convert a 25 meg RAW file to a 60 meg TIFF file, and then a TIFF, all those 150 times 6, 60 meg go into the software. But I don't do JPEGs. I only work in TIFFs, to be honest, when I'm in computer land, so to speak. Yeah.
Right. That's great. Another question is, roughly how many slime molds do you think you've harvested or found in your Slimariums?
Oh my goodness.
10, 100, 1,000?
Oh, look, I guess it's probably well in excess of 10. It's probably more like probably I'm up to about 30 or 40 varieties in the last 12 to 15 months through the Slimarium alone, and I get repeats like Ceratio comes up all the time. I always get a flush of Hemitrichia up, when I've wet them down. So I get repeats a lot. So I go, just that one again, and leave it go. But yes, I guess
so exciting. Yes,
it's brilliant. I love it. Yeah, it's never a dull moment. Yeah.
Now, somebody else has asked, a lot of these things that you've been working with, do you make them yourself, get them specially made up? You don't just buy them off the shelf, do you?
Okay, so, well, studio equipment, standard cameras, all pretty much, off the shelf. The actual little stage that I showed you, I need to just mention to you that John Vanderheuvel showed me that design, and I don't know whether he created it himself, but most certainly it was he that brought the ability to actually move that stage up and down and back and forth. So that was built himself, but it was based on a design that he had done and showed me, which I was delighted because I was struggling, just spending 10 minutes trying to get a tiny little object, find it, and then put it in the right spot. So I guess it's a bit of everything. It's problem solving no matter how whether it's through equipment that you buy or whether you do it off, make it yourself. Yeah.
And it's great fun collaborating with people, isn't it?
Absolutely, and as a result, I'm desperately happy to share all this stuff with anyone who's keen to listen. So, yeah.
That's lovely. I'll just see if there's any. So, are all your backgrounds natural, or do you work
I
with
love
different
this question. I love this question. So I'm going to show you my my mouse pad, which happens to be an NRMA magazine, and in here I find lovely, lovely landscape scenes with green and blue and all sorts of things. So when I'm shooting here in my studio, I'm not going to put up a black or a white or a plain old background. I don't know whether you probably can't see it in the background there, but just that little square that I'm pointing to at the moment is a cutout from the NRMA magazine that happens to be my backdrop. So my backdrops are literally they're basically landscapes, but they're sort of out of a magazine.
Right. Okay. Very
Good
idea. Yes, that's a very clever way of doing it. Cool. Have you ever thought about doing time lapses?
Yes. I've got a couple of time lapses up on my YouTube channel. My Plasmodium crawling around, and I will also have done Hemitrichia colliculata. I've done them sporulating.
Wow.
There's not a very good time lapse, but I tried it and I love it. And there's work to be done there. That's an exciting area to work with. So maybe if I fall foul of not being able to get down, to that level, maybe it's the time lapses that will take up some time, because it is a fun process indeed. Great question.
And that is a very fun process. Yeah. Well, that's as many questions as I have here at the moment. One thing I would like to share with you is when the first time that I became aware of slime molds is when the fungi project here was actually going out on our first foray in Star Swamp, and we found what we thought this little red glob of something. So we took a photo, brought it back to Margaret Brims, who was working in the West Australian Herbarium on fungi then, and I was saying, like, how do I know if it's a slime mold? What criteria do I have? And we decided together that her definition was little coloured dots on wood.
There you go. Great description. Yeah, little
Very
coloured
helpful.
dots in multitude.
Yes, that's very much the case. So I'd like to pass it over to Susie now to wrap things up.
Thank you very much, Roz. And was it your grandson who just recently discovered a whole new species of slime mold?
Well, it wasn't a whole new species. It was just one that had never been found in Kings Park before. But yes, it was my 4-year-old grandson who found it in Kings Park.
Excellent. Yes. Great job.
Yeah, we're very proud of him.
Yeah. Always get them young and keep them for life. Anyway, this ends our lecture. Thank you, Steve, for your valuable time. And wow, so much stuff I now have to think about to take away and prep my cameras for. But excellent. And I think we missed 1 or 2 questions, but we can get to those and send you the answers. But I'm sure everybody learnt something tonight. And yeah, Vanessa, yay! Steve's also got an Instagram, which is at YoungSteve100, and he's on the Facebook Slime Mold ID site or page, and various other pages, Friends of Dorigo, I can never remember the name of that.
Borrow with
have to.
friends, FWF.
Thank you. Borrow with friends at Dorigo. I love going to those. They're fabulous. So if you've got any other questions, please send them through to Sophie at fungimapcoord@gmail.com, and we'll endeavour to answer these and get them through to Steve so that he can answer them for you. And if you'd like to join FungiMap, purchase any books, or just have a good look around, please go to our website, fungimap.org.au. Also, if you've enjoyed this Funginar / Mixinar Slimanar tonight with Steve Young, you may like to book our next month's Funginar, which is with Lynn Allison, who is FungiMap committee member. And I've just realised she was now I remember why I know her name. She was a Democrat senator for Victoria up until 2008 for 12 years. But she's been involved with re-vegging Westgate Park, which is 34 hectares, planted with over 300 native species. And she's now been able to identify up to 60 species of fungi there. So great insight into re-veg and trying to bring these wonderful lost spaces back to life. So thank you, everyone. Good night from FungiNet, and see you at the next Funginar. Bye. Thanks,
Bye.
Steve.
Thank you.
Bye, Roz.